5 men bought me for $3,000 in 1965, and that very day decided when and how I would die. But today, at 75 years old, I'm here to tell a story that many prefer to pretend doesn't exist in our America. My name is Anne Frances Sanders, and everyone here in Westridge, rural Kentucky, knows me as Miss Anne the Craftswoman, the lady who transformed corn husks and fabric scraps into pieces that even tourists take home. But few know the thorny path I traveled to get here. Perhaps that's why I decided to record these videos. Because certain truths need to be told before I leave this world. I was born in 1948 in a small settlement called Cougar Hollow, which doesn't even exist on maps anymore. It was about 20 miles from what is now Jefferson County. It was such a tiny place that it didn't even have a hospital. That's why I came into this world by the hands of a midwife, Miss Hattie, in a wooden house with a dirt floor. My mother, Celeste, didn't survive childbirth. I lost my mother before even knowing the warmth of her embrace or hearing her voice singing me to sleep. I was raised by my father, Zach, a simple man, but with a heart as big as the country sky. He planted a little bit of everything: corn, wheat, beans, and raised some chickens and a pig or two when possible. We didn't have much, but there was never a shortage of food on the table or love in that house. My father taught me about the world while we worked together. "Anne," he would say while showing me how to plant a seedling, "the earth is generous to those who respect it. You put in a tiny seed, take good care of it, and it gives you back a plant full of life. People are like that too. You give love, you receive love back." I didn't have many toys like children today. My dolls were made from corn cobs, with husks for hair, and dresses made from scraps my father got from the neighbors. He did everything possible so I wouldn't feel the absence of a mother so much. But there were moments, like when other girls had their hair braided or were learning to sew, that the emptiness ached deep in my chest. I grew up this way, daughter of the land, running barefoot through the woods, learning to recognize plants that healed and those that killed, listening to the stories of the elders on full moon nights when we gathered in the churchyard to chat and pass the time. It was a simple childhood, but happy in its own way. My father, even being a rough country man, had a special gentleness with me. I think he saw my mother in my eyes, as many said. Things began to change when I was 15. My father, who was already past 50, met Carmen at a county fair in Springfield. She was about 20 years younger than him, a widow too, with a way of speaking softly and a smile that hid well what was behind it. Unlike the women from our settlement, she wore red lipstick, had painted nails, and smelled of store-bought perfume. She said she was from Chicago and had come to the countryside, looking for a quieter life. My heart tightened the first time I saw her. It wasn't jealousy, as my father thought. It was a premonition, one of those that creeps up your spine and makes your neck go cold even on a hot day. But who was I to say anything? My father deserved companionship, someone to care for him in his old age, and she seemed so interested in his stories, so attentive. 6 months after their first meeting, Carmen was already living with us, and they had married in a simple ceremony in the town's little church. At first, she made an effort to please me. She made my favorite dishes, brought me a new dress as a gift, even taught me how to apply lipstick to look pretty for the boys. But her eyes never smiled when her mouth smiled at me. And when my father wasn't around, she simply ignored me, as if I were invisible. I should say I tried, my dears. I swear I tried to open my heart to that woman. I helped with household chores without complaining, complimented her cooking, listened attentively to her stories about life in the big city. But there was a wall between us, built with bricks of distrust that neither of us knew how to tear down. My father, poor man, didn't notice anything. Or perhaps he didn't want to notice. He was bewitched by that woman, as if he had drunk one of those potions that the local healers prepared to bind the hearts of indecisive men. When I tried to say something, he would just smile and say, "It's daughter's jealousy, Anne. It will pass. You'll see how Carmen is a blessing that fell from heaven for us." Blessed ignorance of his. If I could go back in time, I would have screamed, begged, done anything to open his eyes. But fate was already tracing its twisted paths, and we, like blind ants, were just following the sugar trail that would lead us straight into the trap. It was in January 1965, at the height of winter, that my world completely collapsed. My father had gone to town to sell our small bean crop. He returned after nightfall, with a high fever and a chest pain that made him bend over like an old man. Carmen prepared a lemon balm tea and put him to bed. "You'll feel better tomorrow," she said, with a certainty that I only understood much later. But he didn't get better. In the early morning, I woke to her screams. When I reached the bedroom, my father was staring blankly at the ceiling, his mouth open in silent astonishment. He had passed during sleep, without saying goodbye, without giving me one last piece of advice or a final blessing. "Hey, you who's watching me now. It might seem like I'm telling this with a calmness that doesn't match the pain, but it's been 57 years that have passed. Pain becomes a callus on the soul. You know? If you're enjoying my story, help me by hitting like and subscribing to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. An old woman like me is curious to know how far my voice can reach on this internet thing. Thank you for your company, you hear?" The funeral was quick, as was customary in rural areas. There was no way to preserve the body in that cold, and the cemetery was an hour's walk from our house. I remember the weight of the simple coffin, made of cheap wood, carried by the neighbors. I remember the sound of earth falling on it. I remember the rough hands of acquaintances squeezing mine, saying words that made no sense to me at that moment. Carmen cried, and how she cried. She sobbed loudly, needed to be supported so she wouldn't fall, repeated my father's name like a litany. But when we returned home, when the last neighbors had gone and it was just the two of us, she wiped away her tears as if dusting furniture, and her eyes were as dry as the cemetery earth. "Sit down, girl. We need to talk," she said, lighting a cigarette, a vice she had never shown in front of my father. I sat at the kitchen table, still dazed by the loss, not imagining that the worst was yet to come. "Your father wasn't the man you thought," she began, exhaling smoke through her nostrils. "He had debts, many debts. He owed dangerous people who don't play around." This didn't make sense. My father was the most honest person I'd ever known. He lived simply precisely so he would never owe anything to anyone. He himself used to say, "If you owe, you sell yourself, and I was born free and want to die free." "What debts?" I asked, my voice still choked with tears. "Gambling," she promptly replied. "Your father gambled, bet everything he had. Why do you think we never managed to have anything of value? Why do you think he sold the crops for any pittance? It was to pay the interest on the debts, but the principal just kept growing." I shook my head, incredulous. It was a blatant lie, I knew. My father was never one to gamble, not even an innocent card game after church. But before I could protest, she continued. "The men he owed are coming tomorrow. They want the house, the land, everything. And if they don't have anything to take, they'll take us instead." She took a long drag. "Or rather, they'll take you." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, take me?" "They approached me while you were at the cemetery. They said your father's debt is too big to be paid with this piece of land, but they made an offer." She hesitated, as if thinking of the right words. "There's a group of businessmen, people from New York, who are setting up a big operation here in the region. They need girls to work, cook, clean, that sort of thing. The men said that if you go work for these businessmen for a while, the debt will be settled." "What businessmen? What business? And for how long?" The questions came out of my mouth one after another. "A big ranch, one of those modern ones, with machines and everything. From what I understand, they're bringing people from outside to clear land and plant soy. They need people to take care of the ranch where the workers will stay." She stubbed out her cigarette on a saucer. "As for how long, I can't say for sure. A year, maybe 2. Depends on how much your father owed." I was 17, almost 18. I had never left that settlement, never worked for strangers. But what could I do? It was either this, or lose the land my father had loved so much, the only place I had known as home. "And if I don't go?" I asked, a last thread of resistance. The look Carmen gave me was as cold as a knife blade. "Then they take the land, the house, and the two of us end up on the street. Or worse. These men don't joke around, Anne. Your father knew what he was getting into." That night, I cried until I had no more tears. I cried for my father, for the injustice of that situation, for the fear of the unknown. I knelt beside the bed and prayed as I had never prayed before. I asked God to show me another path, a way out that wouldn't separate me from the only place I knew as home, but no divine answer came. Only the silence of the night, and in the distance, the sound of Carmen packing her things in a room that once belonged to my father. The next morning, with the sun still rising timidly on the horizon, an old, noisy Jeep stopped in front of our house. 3 men got out, a fat one with a straw hat, who seemed to be the boss, a tall, thin one, with a scar that cut across his face from temple to chin, and a younger one, not much older than me, who kept his eyes lowered, as if ashamed to be there. Carmen was already up, dressed as if she were going to town, the red lipstick impeccable on her thin lips. She pushed me out of the room. "Go, get ready. Take only the essentials, they don't have all day." With trembling hands, I put some clothes in a bundle, along with a photo of my father and the rosary that had belonged to my mother, the only objects of sentimental value I owned. When I returned to the living room, the men were talking in low voices with Carmen, who was smiling in a way I had never seen before. "Here she is," announced my stepmother, as if presenting merchandise. "Healthy, strong, knows how to cook and clean. She'll serve your employer's purposes well." The fat man looked me up and down, as if evaluating a head of cattle. Yes. She seems adequate. Are the documents ready?" Carmen handed him a manila envelope. "Everything as agreed." It was at that moment that a chill ran down my spine. What documents could those be? What was really happening there? Can I say goodbye to my stepmother?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. The fat man shrugged. "Be quick. We have a long road ahead." I approached Carmen, who smiled, that fake smile that never reached her eyes. "Thank you for raising me," I said, the words coming out mechanically. It wasn't what I wanted to say, but what I could say in front of those men. She hugged me, a cold, calculated hug. And then she whispered in my ear, words that froze my blood. "Goodbye, stepdaughter. Don't worry about coming back. No one expects you to return." Before I could react, I was taken to the Jeep. The man with the scar pushed me into the back seat, next to the younger guy, who continued to avoid my gaze. The engine roared, and we began to move away from the only home I had ever known. Through the window, I saw Carmen waving, that fake smile still on her lips. And then, when she thought we were too far away to see, she did something that confirmed my worst fears. She took a thick wad of money from her pocket and began to count it, right there, in front of the house where my father had died less than a week ago. That was the last time I saw that woman. And it was when I understood that there was no debt at all, that my father probably never gambled in his life, that I wasn't going to work to pay off any debt. I had been sold. The Jeep followed dirt roads I had never seen, raising red dust that came in through the open windows and stuck to sweaty skin. No one spoke. The fat man drove in concentration, occasionally wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. The one with the scar smoked one cigarette after another, looking out the window as if bored. The young man beside me kept his hands between his knees, his eyes fixed on his own feet. After hours of travel, when the sun was already high in the sky, I timidly asked, "Where are we going? What kind of work will I do?" The man with the scar turned, a malicious smile on his thin lips, quiet. "You speak when told to speak." The fear that was already settled in my chest grew, spreading like poison through my veins. Something was very wrong indeed. We traveled all day, stopping only once for the men to eat at a roadside store. To me, they gave only a piece of hard bread and a cup of water. When night fell, we were already far from any place I could recognize. The stars seemed different. The air had another smell. Even the sounds of nocturnal animals sounded strange to my ears. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the Jeep entered an even more precarious road, which cut through an extensive pasture. In the distance, I saw lights. A large construction, which I later discovered to be an old ranch house from times when cattle reigned absolute in those lands. When the vehicle stopped, my legs were numb from the journey, and my mouth dry from thirst and fear. The man with the scar pulled me by the arm, with enough force to leave marks. "We've arrived," announced the fat man, getting out of the Jeep with a sigh of relief. "Take her inside, Tonho. The boss should arrive early tomorrow." I was dragged into the main house, passing through a wide porch with wooden flooring that creaked with each step. Inside, the furniture was sparse and old, some worn chairs, a long table, kerosene lamps that cast ghostly shadows on the peeling walls. There were other men inside, playing cards and drinking whiskey. When we entered, everyone stopped to observe me, with looks that made me want to shrink until I disappeared. "Is this the new merchandise?" asked one of them, a bald man with a prominent belly. "This very one," replied the man with the scar, Tonho, as they had called him. "The stepmother sold her cheap, $3,000. $3,000. That was the price of my life. Less than the value of 2 head of cattle at that time." "Where's the contract?" asked another man, older, with gray hair at the temples. The fat man, who had followed us inside, took from his pocket the envelope that Carmen had handed him. "Here, all signed, as he likes it." The older man took the envelope, opened it, and examined the papers in the faint light of the lamp. "Seems in order. Transfer of guardianship and waiver of all rights. Signed and notarized." He laughed, a sound that gave me chills. This Carmen is smart. Did everything right to avoid problems later. That's when the full understanding of my situation hit me like lightning. There was no modern ranch. There were no businessmen from New York. There was no job as a cook or maid. There were only these men, this isolated house, and a contract that transformed me into their property. "What? What are you going to do with me?" I managed to ask, my voice almost disappearing in terror. The older man approached, holding my chin forcefully to make me look into his eyes. "I'll be very clear, girl, since you're going to stay with us for a good while, until you wear out or die, whichever comes first. You're ours now. Your stepmother sold you, with documents and everything, like you sell a mare or a cow. And we're going to use you in any way we want, as many times as we want, with whoever we want." My legs weakened. I would have fallen if Tonho hadn't been holding me by the arm. "Take her to the back room," ordered the older man. "Tomorrow, when the boss arrives, we'll start the real work." I was dragged down a dark hallway to a small, stuffy room, with only a thin mattress on the floor and a bucket in a corner. The door was locked from the outside, and I found myself alone in the darkness, with only a sliver of moonlight coming in through a high, barred window. I fell to my knees, the tears finally coming in an uncontrollable torrent. I cried for my father, for myself, for the cruel fate that awaited me. I prayed, begged, bargained with all the saints I knew. But that night, no divine help came, only silence and darkness, and the terrible certainty that, as the gray-haired man had said, I would stay there until I wore out or died. What I didn't know on that desperate night was that my story wouldn't end on that ranch, that I would find within me a strength I didn't know I possessed, that I would survive to tell this story, decades later, to people who weren't even born when it all happened. But that, my dears, is a story for us to continue together. A story of horror, yes, but also of survival, of how a country girl, sold as merchandise, managed to rise from her own ashes. I spent that first night awake, my eyes burning from so much crying, my body aching from the journey, and my soul broken into 1,000 pieces. Every noise startled me. The wind on the old tiles, the creaking of the aged wood, the croaking of frogs in the nearby swamp. Everything seemed threatening. Everything announced that the worst was yet to come. With the first ray of sun entering through the small barred window, I heard movement in the house. Male voices, plates banging, the smell of strong coffee invading even that small back room. I huddled in the corner furthest from the door, hugging my knees, as if I could make myself small enough to disappear. It wasn't long before the key turned in the lock. It was the young man from the Jeep, carrying a mug of black coffee and a piece of hard bread. His eyes remained lowered, avoiding mine, as if he was ashamed of what he was part of. "Eat," he said, placing the mug and bread on the floor near me. "The boss is already arriving." I was so thirsty that I drank the coffee in one gulp, even burning my tongue. The bread was hard, but my stomach ached with hunger. "Please," I whispered, holding the hem of his shirt as he turned to leave. "Help me escape. I don't belong here." He finally looked into my eyes. He was young, maybe early 20s, with a face that could have been handsome if not for the constant expression of fear. "No one escapes from here," he replied, his voice almost as low as mine. "The last one who tried," he didn't finish the sentence, but the way he swallowed hard said it all. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to establish some human connection, some bridge that might save me later. "Jimmy," he answered, and for the first time I noticed his accent. He wasn't from Kentucky. He sounded more like the Tennesseans who sometimes pass through our village. "But knowing my name doesn't help. I can't help you. No one can." With that, he left, locking the door behind him. I sat there on the thin mattress, the bitter taste of coffee still in my mouth, trying to understand how my life had turned upside down so quickly. A week ago, I was safe at home, with my father still alive, my future simple but honest ahead of me. Now, I was trapped in an isolated ranch, sold as merchandise, waiting for a boss who would decide my fate. About 2 hours later, or perhaps more, for time seemed to drag in that suffocating little room, I heard the sound of a car arriving. A powerful engine, different from the old Jeep that had brought me. Animated voices, greetings, laughter. The boss had arrived. I ran my hands through my tangled hair, trying to fix myself up by pure instinct. As if that mattered. As if it could improve my situation in some way. The door opened violently, and Tonho, the man with the scar, entered, pulling me by the arm. "Come, the boss wants to see you." I was dragged to the room where the men had been playing cards the night before. Now, seated in an armchair that seemed out of place in that decadent environment, too new, too expensive, was a middle-aged man, well-trimmed gray hair, light linen suit, gold watch on his wrist. He looked like a politician or a rich rancher from the region, the kind that appeared in the newspaper that rarely reached our settlement. Around him, like obedient watchdogs, were the men from the night before, including the fat man who drove the Jeep and the old man with gray hair at the temples. All seemed anxious to please, offering drinks, cigarettes, smiling at every word of that man. "So this is the new acquisition?" asked the man in the suit, observing me with cold eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. There was no lust in his gaze, which was perhaps even more frightening. It was as if he was evaluating an object, something soulless, without value beyond its utility. "Yes, doctor," replied the old man with gray hair. "From the Westridge region. Orphan, documents in order, everything as agreed." The man, doctor they called him, stood up and walked around me, examining me as if I were a piece of cattle at auction. "Age? 17, almost 18, the fat man promptly replied. "Health? Perfect as far as we can tell. Grew up on a farm, she's strong. Previous experience?" There was a moment of embarrassed silence. "None that we know of, doctor." The old man with gray hair finally replied. The stepmother didn't mention anything. The doctor smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Better that way. I like raw material, without previous vices or habits." He stopped in front of me, raising my chin with a finger to force me to look at him. "What's your name, girl?" I swallowed hard, tasting fear in my mouth. "Anne," I replied, my voice almost disappearing. "Anne Frances Sanders." "Well, Anne Frances," he said, still holding my chin. "I hope you've understood your situation. You were legally acquired. I have documents that your stepmother signed transferring your guardianship to me. These documents say you're my employee, working to pay off your late father's debt. But we both know that's just a formality, don't we?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Fear had frozen my voice. "The truth," he continued, "is that you were bought. I paid good money for you. And like any property, you have a specific purpose." He finally released my chin, returning to his armchair. "You will serve the men who work for me, in all the ways they desire, for as long as I decide you should serve." A chill ran down my spine. Even in my small-town innocence, I knew what that meant. "And if I refuse?" I asked, finding a thread of courage at the bottom of my soul. The doctor smiled again, that cold, calculated smile. "Try it," he replied simply. Then, as if he were discussing the weather or the harvest, he turned to the other men. "You can start. I want to see if the investment was worth it." What happened next, my dear listeners, is something that still costs me to tell, even after so many decades. How to narrate the unnarratable. How to put into words the destruction of a soul. I'll try to be direct without being crude, honest without being explicit. There are certain pains that, even when shared, remain only ours. I was taken to a different room, larger than the previous one, with a real bed, a privilege that I soon understood was not for my comfort, but to facilitate what would follow. Tonho, the man with the scar, was the first, then the fat one, then others I didn't even know, men who arrived throughout the day, ranch hands from other farms in the region, bodyguards, drivers, all knowing there was fresh meat, as they said, laughing among themselves. I resisted at first. I fought, scratched, bit, screamed until my voice disappeared. But there were many of them. They were strong, and with each resistance, the violence increased. Soon, I learned that it was better to disconnect my mind, to send my thoughts far away, to the happy days with my father, to the stories the old folks told on moonlit nights, to the prayers I learned in childhood. The doctor observed everything the first time, sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, calmly drinking whiskey, as if he were watching any ordinary spectacle. He didn't participate. Never participated, I later discovered. His pleasure came from elsewhere, from absolute control, from seeing suffering without needing to dirty his own hands. When I was finally left alone, it was already late at night. My body was broken, marked, aching in ways I never imagined possible. I curled up in a corner of the bed, trembling not from cold, but from a fear so deep that it seemed to have embedded itself in my bones. That's when I heard the door open again. It was Jimmy, the boy with the lowered eyes. He brought water, a damp cloth, and a bottle of herbs. "To clean the wounds," he said, avoiding looking directly at me. "And the herbs help with the pain." I accepted in silence, my throat too raw to speak. As I drank the bitter herbal mixture, I noticed that his hands were trembling. "Why are you here?" I finally asked, my voice a hoarse whisper. "You don't seem like them." He shrugged, a tired movement. "Debt. Like everyone who's trapped here in one way or another." He paused, looking directly into my eyes for the first time. I was a ranch hand on a farm the doctor bought. I had an agreement with the former owner, who would pay me at the end of the season. When the doctor took over, he said the debt was his now, that I would work for him until it was paid. That was 3 years ago. "And are you part of this?" I asked, each word hurting in my injured throat. He looked away again. "I do what they tell me. If I don't," he showed a scar on the back of his neck, half hidden by his hair. "But not with the girls. That I don't do. That's why they keep me as a house employee, sometimes a driver. I'm the only one they trust not to run away with you." "You? Are there others?" He shook his head. "Not anymore. The last one couldn't take it. A few months ago." A shiver ran down my spine. "Couldn't take it how?" "Killed herself. Got a kitchen knife somehow. It was quick at least." He spoke with a coldness that could only come from having seen too much, too many horrors to continue caring. At that moment, I completely understood my situation. It wasn't just the abuse, the physical pain, the humiliation. It was the certainty that no one would come to save me, that no one even knew where I was, that for the outside world, I probably no longer existed. "How long?" I asked, my voice failing. "How long until you can't take it anymore?" he completed. "Depends. The last one lasted 8 months. The one before, almost a year. There was one who lasted 2 years, but in the end, they all end up the same. 2 years, 24 months of that hell. 730 days if I was lucky. The idea was so overwhelming that I almost wished I had that knife the girl before me had managed to get. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why are you helping me?" Jimmy shrugged again. "I'm not helping. I'm just doing what I'm told, taking care that you last as long as possible. The doctor invested money in you, wants a return." He stood up, collecting the empty cup. "Try to sleep. Tomorrow it all starts again." And so it was. Day after day, week after week, the same brutal routine. The same men, sometimes new ones, when the doctor held business meetings at the ranch. The same pain, the same horror, repeated so many times that I began to feel as if that girl who grew up happily on the farm with her father had died, and I was just a ghost occupying a body that no longer belonged to me. I lost track of time. The days blended together, the nights were the same. I tried to mark the days by scratching the wall with a piece of plaster that had come loose, But at some point I stopped counting. For what? Time had lost its meaning. I began to understand why the girl before me had chosen the knife. Every morning I woke up was a disappointment. I was still alive. I would still have to face another day of that hell. Death began to seem like a friend, a liberator, and not an enemy. That's when something changed. I can't say exactly when, perhaps 3 or 4 months after my arrival. It was a particularly hot night, the air still and heavy as it always gets before the big summer storms. I was lying on the bed, looking at the ceiling, my eyes dry because I had no more tears. And then, out of nowhere, a thought hit me. If I died, they would win. If I killed myself, like the girl before me, I would be giving them exactly what they expected. The doctor would simply buy another girl, and the cycle would continue. Something inside me, something I thought they had killed, awoke. A cold, calculated anger, different from the desperate anger of the first days. A determination that was born not from hope, but from the absolute lack of it. If I was going to die, and I was sure I would, it wouldn't be by my own hands. And before I left, I would take some of them with me. It was as if a sudden clarity had descended upon me. I began to observe, really observe, the patterns, the routines, the weak points, who drank too much, who let their guard down, who had the keys, who went where and when. I also began to observe Jimmy more closely. He continued to be the only one who treated me with a minimum of humanity, bringing food, clean water, herbs for the wounds. He never participated in the abuse, although sometimes he was forced to watch, as a reminder from the doctor that he too was property, not so different from me. I realized that Jimmy wasn't just the weakest link in that chain of evil. He was someone who, like me, was trapped in a system he hadn't chosen. The difference was that he had resigned himself, while I was now determined to fight. I began to talk to him, not about escape, not yet, it would be too risky, but about other things, about where we came from, about our families, about life before that place. My father was a cattle driver in Tennessee, he told me one night, while applying herbs to the cuts one of the men had left on my back. Died when I was 12, trampled by a wild bull. My mother couldn't handle the grief and followed soon after. I grew up from ranch to ranch, working for a plate of food. Never thought about escaping from here? I asked, trying to make the question sound casual. He laughed, a sound without joy. And go where? The doctor has friends everywhere, police, judges, politicians. Stories about this place are hushed up before they even reach the ears of someone who could do something. And who would believe a ranch hand with nothing to his name against a man like him? I didn't respond, but I kept that information. It was true. In a time and place where the powerful made their own laws, who would listen to an orphaned girl or a family-less ranch hand? Justice, if it came, would have to come from our own hands. The days continued to pass, and I continued to observe, plan, feed that cold anger that was now my only fuel. I began to become what they least expected, docile. I no longer resisted, didn't scream, didn't cry. This disconcerted some of them at first, but they soon interpreted it as a breaking of spirit, exactly what they wanted. The doctor visited the ranch every 2 weeks, usually staying from Friday to Sunday. He always brought guests, men like him, rich, powerful, with the same insatiable hunger for control and cruelty. During one of these visits, about 6 months after my arrival, I heard something that changed everything. I was serving drinks on the porch, a promotion I had received for my submissive behavior. The doctor was talking with a man I had never seen before, a politician from the capital from what I understood. "And how long do you keep them?" asked the man, taking a sip of whiskey. "Depends," replied the doctor, lighting a cigar. "When they start to lose their bloom, the charm of novelty, or when they become too sick to be useful. Generally, a year and a half. And afterward?" The doctor shrugged. "There's a place in the river, a bend where the current is strong. The body goes down to the Ohio and from there to the Mississippi. To this day, none has appeared." The man nodded as if they were discussing the fate of old furniture, not human beings. "And the current one? The one serving us?" "Ah, she has been surprising." The doctor smiled, blowing cigar smoke. "I thought she wouldn't last 3 months when she arrived. Fought like a wild cat. But now, completely domesticated. I might keep her a little longer if she continues like this. I kept my face expressionless, serving another round of drinks to the men, but inside, my heart was racing. Now I knew, no matter how submissive I was, how domesticated I appeared, my fate was sealed. At some point, when the doctor decided I would be taken to that bend in the river and my body would go down the current to never be found again, time was running out. That night, when Jimmy came to bring clean water as he always did, I made the decision. It was time to put him to the test. "I need to tell you something," I whispered, making sure no one could hear. I heard the doctor talking about what happens when he gets tired of the girls. Jimmy tensed up. "You shouldn't be listening to conversations." "The river," I continued, ignoring his warning. He talked about a place in the river where the current takes the bodies. He set down the water jug carefully, avoiding my eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know you're not like them," I replied, holding his wrist. "You're trapped here as much as I am, and I know you're not a murderer." "I'm not the one who takes the girls to the river," he said, finally looking into my eyes. "I've never done that, but you know who does," I insisted. "And you know that one day it will be my turn." He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. I saw the truth in his eyes. "Let's escape together," I proposed, my voice barely above a whisper. "You know this place. You know the routines. I've been observing too. We can do it." "It's suicide," he replied. But I noticed he didn't immediately reject the idea. "They have guns. They have men everywhere. And we have the element of surprise," I argued. "No one expects the domesticated girl to try to escape. No one expects the loyal employee to betray them." I saw the conflict in his eyes, the fear ingrained by years of abuse and control, fighting against a spark of hope he probably thought he had lost long ago. "I'll think about it," he finally said, freeing himself from my grip. "But I don't promise anything. And don't talk about it anymore for now. Walls have ears in this place." It was enough. A small victory, a crack in the apparently impenetrable wall of my captivity. That night, I slept better than I had in months. In the following days, I maintained my facade of docility, while internally I was boiling with plans and possibilities. I observed everything with even more attention. The shifts of the men who guarded the ranch, where they kept the keys to the vehicles, who slept heavily after drinking, who was more careless with their gun. Jimmy kept his distance, more cautious than ever, but I could see in the quick glances we exchanged that he was seriously considering my proposal. The seed had been planted. About a week after our conversation, something happened that accelerated our plans. The doctor arrived unexpectedly on a Wednesday, alone, without the usual weekend guests. He seemed agitated, worried, something I had never seen before. While serving coffee in the living room, I heard part of his conversation with Tanho, the scarred man who seemed to be his right-hand man. "We need to clean everything up," the doctor was saying, his voice low but tense. "They're investigating the disappearance of that girl from Corbin." "I thought we had settled that with the family," Tanho replied. "The father received the money, didn't he?" "He did, but it seems the mother didn't accept it. She went to the federal police, filed a complaint. There's a new sheriff, not one of ours. He's digging deep." "And the current merchandise?" asked Tanho, referring to me as if I wasn't just a few feet away from them. "It's been what, 6, 7 months?" The doctor looked at me, and for the first time I saw something different in his eyes. Not desire or pleasure in my suffering, but cold calculation. "It's getting risky to keep for too long. If this sheriff starts connecting the dots..." He made a gesture with his hand, cutting the air. "Clean everything up by the end of the week, her included." My blood froze. End of the week. 2, 3 days at most. That was the time I had before being taken to that bend in the river. That night, when everyone had already retired and the house was silent except for the snores of some drunk in one of the rooms, the door to my room opened silently. It was Jimmy, his face a mask of determination and fear. "We're going to do it," he whispered. "Tomorrow night. We don't have much time." "I heard," I confirmed. "They're going to take me to the river by the end of the week." He nodded, tense. "The doctor will leave early tomorrow. He'll leave only 4 men here, Tanho, the fat one, and 2 guards. Thursday night is when they always drink more, playing cards until late. It's our best chance." How will we do it? I asked, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. I have access to the keys to the old Jeep, Jimmy explained. It's parked behind the barn, where you can't hear the engine from the house. If we can get there without being seen, we can have a few hours' advantage before they realize. It was a simple plan, full of weak points, but it was all we had. We spent the next hour refining details, the escape route from the room to the barn, what we would take, practically nothing to not raise suspicions, where we would go, a big city, maybe Louisville, where it would be easier to get lost in the crowd. If they catch us, I began, my voice failing when I thought of the consequences. If they catch us, we're dead, Jimmy completed, the brutal frankness in his voice. But if we stay, you're dead anyway. And he took a deep breath, I can't live like this anymore. I can't be complicit in another death. With this somber understanding, we sealed our pact. A pact made not of hope, but of desperation. Not of optimism, but of cold determination. In the 24 hours that followed, I maintained the same routine, the same submissive behavior, while inside I counted every minute, every second. The doctor left the following morning, as Jimmy had predicted, leaving instructions for Tonho that I couldn't hear, but whose meaning I knew all too well. The day dragged on in an agony of waiting. I served food to the men, cleaned the house, endured the usual abuse, all while an invisible clock ticked in my head. When night finally fell and the card game began in the living room, accompanied by bottles of cheap whiskey, I felt I was about to explode with tension. Jimmy appeared in my room around 11, when the men were already quite drunk, laughing loudly and discussing bets. It's time, he whispered. I managed to get this. He showed a small pocket knife, probably stolen from the kitchen. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. I nodded, taking the knife with trembling hands. I didn't say that I already had my own plan to get a better weapon, if necessary. We left the room silently, walking against the wall of the dark hallway. From the living room came altered voices, laughter, the sound of bottles hitting the table. One of the men was singing an off-key country song. The plan was to cross the kitchen and exit through the back door, circling the house until we reached the barn where the Jeep was. We were almost reaching the kitchen door when the unthinkable happened. One of the guard dogs began to bark furiously in the yard. At that same moment, we heard a chair being dragged in the living room, and Tonho's voice, "What the hell is that dog barking at? Go check, fatso." We exchanged panicked looks. There was no time to return to the room without being seen. The only option was to move forward, quickly, before the fat man reached the kitchen. We ran through the kitchen, Jimmy in front, me right behind. He opened the back door as silently as possible, and we went out into the night, a moonless night, thank God, which gave us some cover. We had barely taken 10 steps when we heard the kitchen door open again. "They're escaping!" shouted the fat man, his voice cutting through the silence of the night like a knife. "Run!" shouted Jimmy, grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the barn. We ran like I had never run in my life, fear giving wings to our feet. Behind us we heard voices, barking, the sound of guns being cocked. The barn seemed infinitely distant, even though it was less than 100 yards from the house. When we finally reached the barn door, Jimmy struggled with the keys, his hands shaking so much he could barely fit them in the lock. Come on," he muttered, desperation making his voice high-pitched. The door finally opened, and we entered the darkness of the barn, the smell of diesel fuel and dry hay invading my nostrils. The Jeep was there, a dark shape in the farthest corner. "The keys are hidden under the seat," said Jimmy as we ran to the vehicle. "Do you know how to drive?" "No," I replied, realizing for the first time a huge flaw in our plan. "Then you'll have to learn quick, in case—" He didn't complete the sentence, but he didn't need to, in case he couldn't be with me until the end. We were a few yards from the Jeep when the barn door burst open. Silhouetted against the faint starlight was Tonho, the scar on his face looking even more terrible in the gloom, a shotgun in his hands. "Did you really think you'd escape?" He laughed, a sound without humor. "The doctor will love to know what you tried to do. He'll have a special way for both of you." Jimmy positioned himself in front of me, protecting me with his body. "Let her go, Tonho," he pleaded, his voice trembling but determined. "The blame is mine. I forced her to come with me." Tonho laughed again. How touching, The coward found courage. Too late, boy. He raised the shotgun, pointing directly at Jimmy's chest. The doctor said to clean everything up, you two included. That's when something inside me snapped. All those months of terror, of pain, of humiliation culminated in a single moment of crystalline clarity. Without thinking, I acted. The small pocket knife Jimmy had given me was still in my hand. In a quick movement, I came out from behind him and advanced against Tonho. He didn't expect this. Not from the domesticated girl, not from the merchandise that had accepted its fate. The surprise delayed his reaction by a crucial second. The knife was small but sharp and found its target, Tonho's neck, just below the ear, where the skin is thinner. It wasn't a clean or professional blow. It was desperate, savage, fueled by months of contained rage. Tonho screamed, dropping the shotgun and bringing his hands to his neck, from which blood was gushing. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Jimmy reacted instantly, picking up the fallen shotgun. "To the jeep!" he shouted, pushing me away from Tonho, who had fallen to his knees, still holding his neck. We ran to the jeep. Jimmy shoved the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. At that same moment, we saw the fat man and the other two men arriving at the barn door, armed and shouting. "Get down!" ordered Jimmy, as he maneuvered the jeep toward the open barn door. The men began to shoot, the sound of gunshots deafening in the enclosed space. I felt something warm splatter on my face, Jimmy's blood, who had been hit in the shoulder. The jeep advanced like a fierce animal, running over the fat man who couldn't get out of the way in time. I heard the horrifying sound of bones breaking under the wheels, but I felt nothing. No pity, no remorse, no disgust, just a cold satisfaction thinking that one of my torturers would never hurt anyone again. We left the barn at high speed, Jimmy driving with one hand, the other pressing his wounded shoulder. The other two men continued shooting, but we were already too far for the shots to reach us with precision. "Can you drive?" I asked, seeing the blood flowing between his fingers. "I have to," he replied, his teeth clenched in pain. "If we stop now, we're dead." And so began our desperate flight through the Kentucky night. A wounded man, a broken woman, and the tenuous promise of freedom ahead. What we didn't know at that moment was that our ordeal was far from over. That the road to true freedom would be much longer and more tortuous than we could imagine. That the doctor wouldn't easily give up his property. And that the worst battle wouldn't be against our pursuers, but against the ghosts we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. The jeep bounced violently on the dirt road, each hole sending waves of pain through Jimmy's injured body. His face was pale in the faint light of the dashboard, his lips pressed into a thin line to contain the moans. The blood had soaked his entire shirt sleeve and was beginning to drip onto the seat. "We have to stop and take care of that wound," I said, tearing a piece of my skirt to make an improvised bandage. "We can't stop," he replied, his voice weak but determined. "They'll come after us. The doctor has men all over the region. We need distance." I was certain he wouldn't last much longer. The blood loss, the pain, the shock, everything conspired against us. If Jimmy fainted while driving, we would be lost. "At least let me make a tourniquet," I insisted, already wrapping the cloth above the wound. "If you keep bleeding like this, you won't be able to drive." He nodded weakly, allowing me to tighten the cloth around his arm, well above the wound. It wasn't ideal, and certainly wouldn't replace proper medical care, but at least it would reduce the bleeding. "Where are we going?" I asked, looking at the darkness around us. There was nothing but the dirt road and the woods that extended in all directions. "South," Jimmy replied, his eyes fixed on the road illuminated only by the weak headlights of the jeep. "We have to cross the river. On the other side is another state, harder for them to follow us. The Ohio River, the natural border between Kentucky and West Virginia. If we could cross it, we would have a chance." We drove for what seemed like hours, the sky slowly clearing with the approach of dawn. With each passing minute, Jimmy's breathing became more labored, his face paler. Several times I thought he would faint, but an iron determination kept him conscious, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were his only link to life. When the first ray of sun broke on the horizon, we finally spotted the river. A silver strip serpentining in the distance, so beautiful that I almost cried to see it. It wasn't just water. It was the promise of a new life. "How will we cross?" I asked, realizing there was no bridge in sight. "Ferry," Jimmy replied, pointing to a small construction on the riverbank. "There's an old man who does the crossing. My uncle used it when he took cattle to sell in Huntington." We approached slowly, tension growing with each yard. The ferry was our salvation, but also a choke point. If the doctor's men were watching the crossing points, we would be cornered. The place seemed deserted when we arrived. Just a weathered wooden cabin, a small pier, and a rudimentary ferry tied to it. Jimmy stopped the jeep a few yards from the cabin. "Stay here," he said, trying to open the door. But he was so weak that he could barely move his arm. "I'll go." "You're not going anywhere in that state," I interrupted. "I'll talk to the ferryman." Before he could protest, I got out of the jeep and walked toward the cabin. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I was aware of my appearance, the torn clothes, the visible bruises, the dried blood on my hands. Anyone could see I was running from something. I knocked on the cabin door, trying to control the trembling in my hands. It took a few moments until an elderly man with sun-weathered skin and white hair answered. "Good morning," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "We need to cross the river. My husband is wounded. We had an accident." The old man examined me with astute eyes that seemed to see beyond the lie. He looked at the jeep, where Jimmy was bent over the steering wheel, and back at me. $50, he finally said. "And I don't ask questions." I felt such great relief that I almost collapsed right there. "We don't have money," I admitted. "But we have the jeep. You can keep it after we cross." The old man considered the offer, scratching his thin beard. "A jeep is worth more than $50, he said, a gleam of interest in his eyes. "But it also brings questions I don't want to answer." "Deal." I returned to the jeep and helped Jimmy get out. He could barely stand, leaning heavily on me as we walked to the ferry. The ferryman didn't offer help, just observed in silence, lighting a corn husk cigarette. "You're burning with fever," I murmured to Jimmy as I helped him lie down on the ferry's floor. "We need to find a doctor as soon as we cross." "Doctors ask questions," he replied, his eyes half closed in pain. "And they might report gunshot wounds to the police." He was right, of course, but without medical care, infection would kill him in a matter of days. The ferryman, after briefly examining the jeep, returned and began working on the ropes that held the ferry to the pier. "It'll take about 2 hours to cross," he said, not looking at us. "The river's calm today. That's our luck." As the ferry slowly moved away from the bank, I looked back at the land we were leaving. The land where I was born, where I grew up, where I lost everything, and from where I was now fleeing like a criminal. I felt a strange mixture of pain and relief, of fear and hope. We were almost in the middle of the river when we heard it. The unmistakable sound of engines, not one, but several, approaching rapidly on the road we had traveled. "It's them," Jimmy murmured, trying to sit up. "They found us." The ferryman looked at the bank we were moving away from, where 3 vehicles raising dust were rapidly approaching. "Friends of yours? If they were friends, we wouldn't be running," I replied, the fear returning full force. The old man nodded, as if the answer confirmed something he already suspected. Without saying a word, he began to row with more force, new energy in his elderly arms. The vehicles stopped at the bank. Even at a distance, I could recognize the silhouette of the doctor getting out of the front car. He gesticulated, shouted orders, and soon 2 men ran to a small boat docked further down the river. "They're going to catch up with us," I said, the desperation evident in my voice. "That boat is much faster than this ferry." The ferryman looked at the boat that was now beginning to slide across the water in our direction, and then at us. A wounded man and a terrified woman. Something in his eyes changed. "You two, hide under that tarp," he ordered, pointing to a corner of the ferry where there were tools and ropes covered by a dirty tarp. "And don't make a single sound, no matter what happens." We had no choice but to trust him. I helped Jimmy crawl under the tarp, accommodating him in the best way possible to not worsen the wound, and lay down beside him. The smell of mold and oil was suffocating, and the heat under the tarp was almost unbearable. But none of that mattered. Our lives depended on staying completely still and silent. Through a small gap in the tarp, I saw the boat approaching rapidly. Within minutes, it was alongside the ferry. 2 armed men, one of whom I recognized as one of the henchmen who had stayed at the ranch, looked at the ferryman with threatening expressions. "Seen a man and a woman pass by here? Him wounded, her young?" one of them asked, the gun casually pointed at the old man. The ferryman continued rowing, as if the question didn't deserve to interrupt his work. "Lots of people cross my ferry," he finally replied. "I don't pay attention to who comes and goes. We're talking about today, old man. In the last few hours." The ferryman stopped rowing, leaning on the oar as he faced the men. "Only one who passed today was a peddler, early this morning. Alone. Said he was going to sell trinkets in Huntington." The men exchanged looks. "Are you sure? Because if you're lying—" "I'm too old to lie," replied the ferryman, going back to rowing. "And too old to be afraid of thugs like you." There was a tense moment where I thought the men would shoot the old man right there. I felt Jimmy tensing up beside me, his hand searching for mine under the tarp. Finally, one of the men spat into the water. "Let's go. They must have taken another route." The boat moved away, quickly returning to the bank where the doctor was waiting. We remained motionless under the tarp for a few more minutes until the ferryman spoke. "You can come out. They're gone." We emerged from the hiding place, the momentary relief soon replaced by concern for Jimmy, who was now burning with fever, his face shining with sweat. "Why did you help us?" I asked the ferryman, while wetting a piece of cloth in the river to place on Jimmy's forehead. The old man continued rowing, his eyes fixed on the distant bank. "I recognize the doctor's work when I see it," he finally said. "It's not the first time I've helped someone escape from him." I felt a chill when I realized what that meant. We weren't the first to try to escape. Probably wouldn't be the last. The others, did they make it? I asked, fearing the answer. The ferryman shrugged. "Some, yes. Others." He didn't complete the sentence, but he didn't need to. The fate of those who didn't make it was easy to imagine. The rest of the crossing was made in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When we finally reached the other bank, the sun was already high in the sky. "There's a settlement about 3 miles in that direction," said the ferryman, pointing to a trail that led away from the river. "There's a woman there, Miss Thelma, who takes care of injured people. Doesn't ask questions." I thanked the old man with tears in my eyes, realizing he had just risked his own life for 2 strangers. "The doctor will know you lied," I said, worried. "It's not safe for you to go back." He smiled, a sad smile of someone who has seen too much in life. "The river is big, girl, and I know every bend of it better than any thug of that man. Don't worry about me." He helped us disembark and watched as we moved away along the trail, me practically carrying Jimmy, who could barely stay conscious. Before we were out of earshot, the old man called, "Girl, never go back to Kentucky. He'll never stop looking." I nodded, knowing that this advice was worth gold. Kentucky, my birthplace, was now closed to me forever. The walk to the settlement was a test of endurance. Jimmy was getting weaker with each step, and I wasn't in much better shape. Exhausted, hungry, my body still aching from months of abuse. But fear gave us strength, fear and the determination not to die so close to freedom. When we finally sighted the first houses of the settlement, a cluster of simple adobe and straw constructions, I almost collapsed with relief. Some children were playing in the dirt street, and a woman was hanging clothes on an improvised clothesline. "Please," I called, my voice almost gone from exhaustion. "Where can we find Miss Thelma?" The woman looked at us with a mixture of curiosity and caution, her eyes lingering on the deplorable state we were in, especially Jimmy, now delirious with fever, his shirt soaked with blood. "At the end of the street," she pointed, "the house with the pomegranate tree in front." I dragged myself there, practically carrying Jimmy. When I knocked on the door, my strength was at its end. An elderly lady, with white hair tied in a severe bun and keen eyes, answered. "Miss Thelma?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "The ferryman sent us. My friend is wounded." She examined us for a moment, her gaze assessing the situation with the precision of someone who has seen everything in life. "Gunshot wound?" she asked, already opening the door wider. I nodded, without strength to lie or elaborate. "Come in," she said simply. "I'll see what I can do." The interior of the house was simple but clean, with the characteristic smell of dried herbs that painfully reminded me of my own home. of the yard where my father cultivated medicinal plants. Miss Thelma led us to a back room where there was a narrow bed covered with white sheets. "Put him here," she ordered, already rolling up her sleeves. "And you, girl, go wash yourself. There's water in the jug and clean clothes in that chest. Then come help me." I obeyed, grateful for clear instructions that didn't require me to think. I washed myself with the cold water from the jug, removing days of dirt, sweat, and dried blood. The clothes I found in the chest, probably belonging to some daughter or granddaughter of Miss Thelma, were simple but clean, smelling of lye soap. When I returned to the room, Miss Thelma had already cut Jimmy's shirt and was examining the wound. Her expression was grave. "The bullet went through, which is good," she said, without raising her eyes from her work. "But there's infection. I need to clean it well and try to bring down the fever. I can't promise anything." She worked for hours, cleaning the wound with a solution that smelled strongly of whiskey, applying herbal poultices, forcing Jimmy to drink bitter infusions whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. I assisted her, passing her the instruments, holding Jimmy when he thrashed in pain or delirium, silently learning techniques that would one day save other lives. At the end of the day, when finally Miss Thelma declared herself satisfied with the dressing and Jimmy slept, exhausted but with more regular breathing, she invited me to the kitchen. She placed in front of me a plate of grits with salt pork and a cup of goat's milk. "Eat," she ordered. "Then tell me what happened. Or don't tell if you prefer. I don't ask questions, but I listen if you want to talk." I ate like I hadn't eaten in months, with real hunger, not just out of the necessity to survive. When I finished, the words began to come out, first hesitant, then in an uncontrollable torrent. I told everything: my father's death, my stepmother's betrayal, the months of captivity and abuse, the desperate escape. Miss Thelma listened in silence, her face revealing nothing beyond complete attention. When I finished, it was already late at night, and my strength was once again exhausted. I expected horror, pity, perhaps even disbelief. Instead, Miss Thelma simply nodded, as if my story confirmed something she already knew. "You're not the first," she finally said. "The doctor has been operating for years. The authorities pretend they don't see, or are paid not to see. I've already taken care of other girls who escaped, although few managed to." "What happened to them?" I asked, a thread of hope being born from knowing that others had survived. "Some returned to their families when they had somewhere to return to. Others went to big cities, where it's easier to get lost. Others—" She paused, considering her next words. "Others never really recovered. The body heals, but the soul—" I understood what she wasn't saying. "Some wounds are too deep to heal completely. And the doctor? Has no one ever reported him?" Miss Thelma laughed, a dry sound, without humor. "To whom, girl? The sheriff who receives money from him? The judge who frequents his ranch? The politician who protects him in exchange for campaign financing? In this country, those who have money make the law." It was a harsh truth, but undeniable. The world I knew before captivity was already unjust. The world I discovered afterward was brutally unbalanced in favor of the powerful. So he continues doing this, buying girls, using them until he tires of them. "Yes," Miss Thelma completed, "and he will continue until someone more powerful than him decides it's enough, or until something goes very wrong." We stayed in silence for a moment, each lost in her own thoughts. Finally, Miss Thelma stood up, indicating that the conversation was over. "Go rest," she said, pointing to a mat in the corner of the kitchen. "Tomorrow we'll see how your friend is doing, and we'll decide what to do next." I lay down on the mat, exhausted beyond words, but strangely at peace for the first time in many months. I was far from being safe. The doctor was still hunting me. We still had nowhere to go. Jimmy was still fighting infection. But for the first time, there was a real possibility of a future. Not a certainty, just a possibility. And at that moment, that was enough. The following days passed in a strangely comforting routine. In the morning, I helped Miss Thelma treat Jimmy, changing the dressings, preparing the infusions, monitoring the fever that slowly subsided. During the day, I helped her in her tasks, picking herbs in the small yard, attending to people from the settlement who came seeking remedies for various ailments, cooking simple but nutritious meals. At night, we sat at the door of the house, looking at the stars and talking, or staying silent, each with her own ghosts. Jimmy improved gradually. The fever subsided, the wound began to heal, and he went from brief moments of consciousness to hours awake, although still very weak. On one of these occasions, I told him about our current situation. The temporary safety in Miss Thelma's house, the advice to never return to Kentucky, the need to plan our next step. "We need to go far away," he said, his voice still weak but his eyes lucid. "Very far. New York, maybe." New York, the immense city where anyone could disappear in the crowd. A new beginning, as far from Kentucky as possible without leaving the country. The idea had merit. "How do we get there?" I asked. "We have no money, documents, nothing. Miss Thelma can help," he replied. "She knows people, and when I can work again." He left the sentence hanging, but I understood the meaning. We would need to work, save, build a new life from scratch. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. And anything would be better than the hell from which we had escaped. I talked with Miss Thelma that night, laying out our still nebulous plan. She listened attentively, as she always did, and then nodded. "New York is a good choice," she agreed. "I have a nephew who works with a bus company. Maybe he can arrange passage for you when the young man is strong enough to travel." "And documents?" I asked, remembering that ours were at the ranch. "We can't travel without them." Miss Thelma smiled, a cunning smile that didn't match her appearance as a respectable lady. "There are ways, girl. There are always ways." In the weeks that followed, while Jimmy regained his strength, Miss Thelma mobilized her network of contacts, an impressive web of favors and obligations that extended far beyond that small settlement. A cousin who worked in a registry office arranged new documents for us. Anne Frances Sanders ceased to exist, replaced by Mary Cooper, born in Richmond, with no known family. Jimmy became Joseph Miller, also from Richmond. Miss Thelma's nephew got us bus tickets to New York on a route that would take almost a week, with several transfers to make it difficult for any attempt at tracking. "Go as husband and wife," advised Miss Thelma. "It's safer for a young woman to travel accompanied and raises fewer suspicions." The idea made me uncomfortable at first. After months of being abused by men, the mere idea of physical proximity with any of them, even Jimmy, who had risked his life to save me, was disturbing. Miss Thelma noticed my hesitation. "It's just a story, girl," she said gently. "A protection. What you really are to each other, only you need to know." She was right, of course. And Jimmy, from the first day, had never shown anything but respect for me. Perhaps because he also knew abuse, albeit in a different form. Perhaps because, like me, he was also rebuilding himself from the ruins of a destroyed life. On the night before our departure, Miss Thelma called me to the yard, where she hung herbs to dry under the straw roof. In her hands, she had a small cloth bundle. "This is for you," she said, handing me the package. "A beginning for your new life." Inside the bundle was money, not much, but enough to keep us for a few weeks until we found work, and a small dagger, the blade bright and sharp, the handle of polished bone. "The money is to start," she explained. "The dagger is to ensure you never are a victim again. Learn to use it, girl, and never hesitate if you need to." I looked at that extraordinary woman who had saved us, healed us, prepared us for a new life, and felt a gratitude so deep that words seemed inadequate. "How can I thank you?" I asked, my voice choked. Miss Thelma smiled, that wise smile of someone who has seen many dawns. "Survive, girl. Survive and help others when you can. That's how the world changes, one life at a time." The next morning we left on the first bus, me and Jimmy, now Mary and Joseph, sitting side by side, each carrying only a small bundle with the little that Miss Thelma had given us. As the bus moved away from the settlement, I looked through the window at that red earth, that immense sky, that river that had been both barrier and path to freedom. I was 17, almost 18. I had lost everything: my father, my home, my identity, even my name. But I was alive, and for the first time in many months, I had something I thought I had lost forever: hope. The journey to New York was long and tiring, Endless days in uncomfortable buses, nights in noisy bus stations or cheap boarding houses when we could afford it. We crossed West Virginia, Pennsylvania, always moving farther from Kentucky, always looking over our shoulders, always tense when we saw a man who vaguely resembled the doctor's henchman. Jimmy, Joseph now, regained his strength with each day, although the wounded arm would never have the same strength as before. We talked little during the trip, both lost in our own thoughts, our own survival strategies. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but the silence of two survivors who understood, without needing words, what the other had been through. It was only when we arrived in New York, almost a week after leaving Miss Thelma's settlement, that we really talked about the future. We were sitting on a bench at the Port Authority bus terminal, surrounded by the chaos and noise of the largest city we had ever seen, trying to absorb the immensity of the place and the possibilities and dangers it offered. "What now?" I asked, looking at the crowd passing by hurriedly, each person with their own story, their own destiny, no one paying the slightest attention to two newcomers from the South. Joseph, not Jimmy, I needed to get used to the new names, shrugged. "First, find a place to stay. Then, work. Miss Thelma's money won't last long in this city." He was right, of course. We needed shelter, work, a way to survive in this place so different from everything we knew. But there was something more fundamental that we needed to define. "And us?" I asked, the question I had been avoiding since we left the settlement. "What are we to each other now?" He looked at me for a long time, his dark eyes revealing a deep understanding. "We are what you want us to be," he finally replied. "Escape companions, friends. More than that, if one day you're ready, or nothing beyond two people who shared a hell and now follow separate paths. The choice is yours." At that moment, looking at this man who had risked everything to save me, who would forever carry a scar as proof of his courage, I felt something I didn't expect to feel again. Trust. Not love, not yet, perhaps never, but trust. And at that moment, after everything I had been through, trust seemed the most precious feeling in the world. "I want us to stay together," I said, reaching out to hold his hand. "As friends, as companions. The rest, time will tell." He nodded, squeezing my hand gently. "Time will tell," he agreed. And so, on that bus terminal bench, amid the hustle and bustle of a city too big to notice us, we made a silent pact. We would be together in this new phase, protecting each other, building something from nothing. We didn't know then that this something would be much bigger and more significant than we could imagine. We didn't know that the horrors we had lived through, though never forgotten, would one day transform into strength to help others. We didn't know that the false names we had assumed would eventually become as real as those we had left behind. We knew none of this on that bus terminal bench in 1965. We knew only that we were alive, free, and determined to remain so, no matter what the future held. And that's how, my dears, my new life began as Mary Cooper. The life that would eventually lead me here, to you, to this moment when I share a story that I've kept silent for so long. The first months in New York were a test of resilience and adaptation. We, now Mary and Joseph, rented a tiny room in the back of a boarding house in the Bronx, a working-class neighborhood where many Southerners settled when arriving in the big city. The room barely fit a twin bed and a small wardrobe, but for us, accustomed to confinement, it was a palace, mainly because we had the key and no one entered without our permission. Joseph got a job in construction. With his arm still not fully recovered, he earned less than the other laborers, but he accepted any work without complaining. I started by washing clothes for others, then got a job as a cleaner in a textile factory. We woke up before sunrise, returned when it was already night, exhausted but satisfied with every dollar we managed to save. We slept in shifts during the first few months. While one rested, the other kept watch. The fear of the doctor and his men was still so real that we heard their footsteps in every creak of the floor, their whispers in every conversation on the street. It took months until we could sleep a whole night, and years until we stopped obsessively checking if the doors were locked. "Do you think one day we'll stop being afraid?" I asked Joseph one night, about 6 months after our arrival. "I don't know if fear ever goes away completely," he replied thoughtfully, "but I think we learn to live with it, until one day it becomes just a shadow, no longer a monster." He was right, as he usually was about such things. The fear never disappeared completely, but we learned to live with it, to use it as a reminder to be cautious, not as a prison that paralyzed us. Our relationship evolved slowly, with all the care that two deeply traumatized people needed. In the beginning, we were just survival companions, sharing the same space out of necessity and mutual protection. Joseph always slept on the floor, leaving the bed for me, respecting my space, never making any movement that could be interpreted as an advance. With time, trust grew. I began to notice small things, the gentleness with which he spoke to me even after an exhausting day of work, the care he took to always bring a piece of fruit or a candy that he knew I liked, the way his eyes lit up when I entered the room, and most importantly, the infinite patience with my moments of panic, with the nightmares that made me wake up screaming, with the days when I couldn't bear to be touched even lightly. A year after our arrival in New York, on a cold night in June 1966, I took a step that seemed impossible months before. I invited Joseph to sleep in the bed with me, just sleep, nothing more. It was the first time I felt the warmth of another human being without fear, without revulsion, just the comfort of not being alone. Months later, when we finally kissed for the first time, it was as if something frozen inside me slowly began to thaw. It wasn't burning passion or uncontrollable desire. It was recognition, acceptance, a gentle affirmation that perhaps, just perhaps, I could still feel something beyond fear and anger. In 1967, we officially married as Mary and Joseph in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with only 2 co-workers as witnesses. There was no party, no white dress, no family to celebrate, but there was truth. The truth of 2 people who had gone through hell together and chose to continue walking side by side. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to," he told me the night before the wedding. "We can continue as we are. The paper doesn't change anything." "I want to do this," I replied, with a certainty that surprised me. "I want to rebuild something that is ours, not imposed by others. I want to choose, not be chosen." Marriage brought a stability we had never known. With our combined savings, we managed to rent a small 1-room apartment of our own, without having to share a bathroom and kitchen with other tenants. Joseph continued in construction, eventually becoming a foreman, respected for his honesty and hard work. I found a better job as a seamstress in a clothing factory, where my skill with my hands, a legacy of the times when I helped my father on the farm, was quickly recognized. In 1969, I discovered I was pregnant. The news hit me like lightning, bringing to the surface all the fears I thought I had overcome. How could I be a mother after everything I had been through? How could I protect a child in a world that had shown itself to be so cruel? How could I trust my own body, which had been violated in so many ways? Joseph, as always, was my safe harbor. "This child will be loved," he promised, his hands gently placed on my still flat belly. "This child will be protected. We will do differently, Mary. We will do better." Pregnancy was a period of intense transformations, not only physical, but emotional. Each movement of the baby inside me was a reminder that life continued, that my body was not just a receptacle of pain, but also of creation. In the months that my belly grew, something fundamental changed within me. The determination to not only survive, but to live fully, for myself and for the child I carried. Our daughter Hope was born on a rainy dawn in February 1970. When the midwife placed her in my arms, I looked at that little red, wrinkled face and felt something I had never experienced before. A love so immense, so overwhelming, that it seemed not to fit in my chest. And along with that love, a fierce resolution. This child would never know the kind of horror that I had known. This child would be protected, loved, respected in her humanity. Motherhood transformed me in ways I could not have foreseen. The need to protect Hope gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. The nightmares decreased, replaced by the very real and present concern of raising a daughter in better conditions than those I had known. Joseph proved to be an extraordinary father, patient, loving, present. He read to Hope every night, even after exhausting days of work. When she began to walk, he held her little hands with a gentleness that often made me cry silently. thinking of how hands that had known so much violence could be capable of such tenderness. In 1973, we had our second child, Daniel. Our little family was complete, and with it, the feeling that we had achieved the impossible, creating something beautiful and meaningful from the ruins of destroyed lives. As our children grew, so did our financial stability. Joseph had become a respected builder, supervising increasingly larger works. I had opened a small sewing workshop at home, which allowed me to take care of the children while I worked. In 1975, we were able to buy our first house, a simple 2-story house in a middle-class neighborhood in Queens. It was during this time that I began to do something that, until then, I had consciously avoided: looking at the past, not to sink into it, but to understand how it had shaped me, how I could use this experience to help others. I began discreetly, offering temporary shelter to women fleeing situations of domestic violence, a neighbor who appeared with frequent bruises, a colleague from the sewing workshop whose husband drank and lost his head, a young woman who had been sold by her own father to a man 30 years older than her. They came, stayed a few days or weeks in our guest room, received support to find work, housing, a new beginning. Joseph never questioned this new mission I had embraced. On the contrary, he became a valuable ally, talking to other men to arrange jobs for these women, teaching some basic construction skills so they could make small repairs without depending on men, being a living example that not all men are abusive or controlling. In 1980, we formalized this work, creating the New Dawn Association, a shelter for women victims of violence. With the help of some friends and the financial support of Joseph, who now had his own construction company, we managed to rent a larger house, hire a social worker and a lawyer. It wasn't easy work. We faced resistance from the authorities, distrust from a society that preferred not to see violence against women, and occasionally threats from angry husbands or partners. But each woman who managed to rebuild her life, each child who escaped from an environment of abuse, each small victory against a system that naturalized violence, all this made it worthwhile. And for me, personally, this work had an additional meaning. It was my way of transforming the horror I had lived through into something positive, of ensuring that other girls wouldn't go through what I went through. The 80s brought significant changes in the country. The Reagan years, major shifts in how America viewed social services, and increased awareness about domestic violence. We took advantage of this moment to expand our work, establishing partnerships with other organizations, pushing for stricter laws against domestic violence, creating support groups in underprivileged communities. Hope, our daughter, followed in my footsteps. She graduated in social work and began working with us at the association, bringing new ideas and renewed energy. Daniel became a lawyer, specializing in women's and children's rights, often representing our sheltered women for free in cases against abusers. In 1990, I received a letter that would profoundly change my perception of the past. It was from Miss Thelma, the healer who had saved us so many years before. Someone who had passed through her settlement had mentioned our work in New York, and she, with the help of a literate grandson, had written to us. The letter brought news I never expected to receive. The doctor, that man who had been the architect of my personal hell, was dead. Not naturally. He had been murdered on his own ranch, apparently by one of his henchmen, in a dispute over money. The police had investigated the case and, in the process, discovered evidence of his operations trafficking women. Several of his associates had been arrested, others had fled. The ranch had been confiscated by the state. I read that letter so many times that the paper became worn at the folds. I expected to feel relief, perhaps even satisfaction at knowing of that man's death. Instead, I felt nothing, a surprising emptiness where there had been fear and hatred. I realized then that, without knowing it, I had freed myself from him a long time ago. Not completely, the scars remained, but enough that his death was nothing more than distant news, without the power to shake the foundations of the life I had built. Miss Thelma's letter also brought another request, that I return to the South to help establish a network of shelters similar to ours. The girls continue to be sold, she wrote, not by the doctor, but by others like him. And we need someone who understands, who knows how to help them rebuild their lives afterward. After much reflection and long conversations with Joseph and our children, I decided to accept this call. In 1991, for the first time in 26 years, I returned to the South, not to Kentucky, which still carried memories too painful, but to West Virginia, where Miss Thelma now lived with her family. Reuniting with that extraordinary woman, now very elderly but still lucid and determined, was like closing a circle. She hugged me with tears in her eyes, murmuring, "You see? You survived, girl. Survived and did much more than that." In the following years, I divided my time between New York and the South, helping to establish shelters in several small towns, training local women to identify and support victims of abuse, creating a protection network that extended across states where violence against women was particularly normalized. Joseph always supported me in these travels, often accompanying me, other times staying in New York to take care of the association and our growing family. Hope gave us 2 grandchildren, and Daniel, a granddaughter. Our house became the center of a family not only of blood, but of choice. Former sheltered women who became a permanent part of our lives, work colleagues who became close friends, people who entered our lives by chance and stayed by choice. In 2005, Joseph passed away from a heart attack, sleeping peacefully beside me after an ordinary day of work and dinner with the family. The pain of losing him was immense, but different from any pain I had known before. It wasn't the disoriented despair of the teenager sold by her stepmother, but the deep and meaningful grief for a shared life, for a love built patiently over decades. At the funeral, looking at the coffin of that man who had been my savior, my companion, my closest friend, I felt a gratitude so deep that it transcended sadness. Gratitude for having found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, for having chosen to believe that something good could be born from so much horror, for having persevered when it would have been easier to give up. In the years following Joseph's death, I gradually reduced my direct work at the association, passing the leadership to Hope and a team of extraordinary women we had trained over the years. I didn't retire completely. I still gave occasional lectures, participated in events, advised particularly difficult cases. But I began to dedicate more time to another project I had postponed for decades, recording my story. I began to write, first just for myself, as a form of therapy, then with the intention of leaving a record for my family, and finally with the goal of sharing more broadly. The book, Sold and Reborn, A Survivor's Story, was published in 2010 when I was 62 years old. I didn't use my real name, nor Joseph's, nor details that could precisely identify the places or people involved, but the essence of the story was there. The horror, yes, but mainly the journey of reconstruction, of finding meaning beyond the trauma. The book found a much larger audience than I expected. I was invited to television programs, to speak at universities, to participate in debates about human trafficking and violence against women. I always refused to show my face or reveal my true identity, not out of shame, but for protection. Even after so many years, even knowing that the doctor was dead and his empire destroyed, caution had become part of who I was. It was only in 2020, at 72 years old, that I finally felt safe enough to show my face and use my real name in public. The pandemic had accelerated the transition to the digital world, and my grandchildren taught me to use video platforms to continue my awareness work even during isolation. I began recording videos telling my story, first just for closed support groups for survivors of violence, then for a broader audience. The response was overwhelming. Women of all ages, from all over the country, wrote to me to share their own stories of abuse and survival, to thank me for giving voice to experiences that had been silenced for so long. And so we come to today, 2023, where I, Anne Frances Sanders, yes, I reclaimed my birth name a few years ago, a final affirmation that the girl who was sold was not destroyed, only transformed, share my story with you through these videos. I am 75 years old now. My body carries the marks of time and trauma, but also of healing and resilience. My hair is white, my hands calloused from a lifetime of hard work. But my eyes, they tell me, still shine with the same determination that kept me alive in those dark days of 1965. I don't know how much longer I will have in this world, but I know that each day is a victory over those who tried to destroy me. Each woman we help at the association, each story shared, each awareness awakened to the reality of human trafficking and violence against women. All these are seeds planted that will continue growing long after I'm gone. If you've watched this far, my dear, I want you to know that your attention, your time, your willingness to listen to a difficult story mean a lot to me. If you too carry wounds, and who doesn't in one way or another, I hope my journey can offer some comfort, some hope that it's possible to rebuild. It's possible to find meaning beyond the pain. If this video touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so we can reach more people with these stories of overcoming. In the comments, tell me where you're watching from and if you stayed until the end of this long journey with me. This helps me know that I'm not speaking alone, that my words find an echo somewhere. Remember always, your story doesn't end with trauma. What they did to you is just one chapter, not the entire book. You have the power to write the next chapters, and they can be more beautiful and meaningful than you ever imagined. Thank you for listening. Thank you for witnessing. Thank you for remembering. With love, Grandma Ann.